The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. Picture this, a king so magnetic, so powerful, that people actually called him the greatest man in the world. His court sparkled with the most fascinating personalities of the Renaissance, and he ruled with a flair for drama that would make modern celebrities jealous. This is Henry VIII, and yes, he's remembered for splitting from the Catholic Church and reshaping England forever. But there's another reason his name echoes through history, something far more personal and wildly dramatic. The man had 6 wives. 6. Let that sink in for a moment. Now, it's not just the number that makes this story irresistible. It's the women themselves. These weren't decorative background characters in some royal soap opera. They were sharp, ambitious, deeply principled, and sometimes dangerously reckless. Each one had her own dreams, her own battles, her own fight for survival. And here's the thing, their private lives, every whispered secret and broken heart, played out on the world stage, literally shaping the destiny of an entire nation. Alison Weir's masterpiece isn't your typical dusty history book. It's more like a time machine. Millions of readers have been captivated because Weir does something extraordinary. She strips away centuries of myth and Tudor propaganda to show us the real, breathing human beings behind those famous portraits. She helps us understand not just what happened to them, but who they actually were. In the next few minutes, we're diving headfirst into the wild world of the Tudor court. Sure, you might know that famous rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But we're going deeper. We're going to feel the impossible pressure these women lived under, understand their hopes and heartbreaks, and grasp the unthinkable choices they faced. We'll meet the stubborn queen who refused to back down, the calculating woman who literally changed the course of Christianity, the gentle soul who finally gave Henry his precious son, and the others who followed, each walking a tightrope between unimaginable luxury and sudden, brutal danger. By the time we're done, you'll understand something profound about power, love, and fate. The story of these 6 queens isn't just gripping historical drama. It's a timeless lesson about resilience, ambition, and the incredible strength people can summon when facing impossible odds. Ready? Let's step back in time. Before we meet the queens, we need to understand their world, because honestly, it was nothing like ours. Alison Weir paints a vivid, sometimes shocking picture of Tudor England, where a woman's entire existence boiled down to one simple rule: serve and obey men. This wasn't just an opinion. People genuinely believed this was God's design for the universe. The famous reformer John Knox actually wrote that woman in her greatest perfection was made to serve and obey man. From birth, girls were taught they were inferior. Even a queen was expected to submit to her husband, learning from him in silence and subjection. On her wedding day, everything a woman owned, her property, her body, even her life, became her husband's. While a king could openly keep mistresses, any hint of infidelity from a queen was considered treason, punishable by death, because it could mess up the royal bloodline. This was the invisible cage surrounding Henry's wives. They wore crowns, sure, but they were also prisoners of their era, trapped by rules they could never escape. Keep this in mind, because it's the key to everything that follows. Our story actually begins far from England, in the sun-baked palaces of Spain, with a young princess named Catherine of Aragon. Born in 1485, she was the daughter of 2 powerhouse monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Catherine grew up surrounded by war, intense religious devotion, and fierce family pride. When she was just 3 years old, her destiny was decided for her. She was promised to Arthur, the eldest son of England's newly crowned Henry VII. It was pure politics, a strategic marriage to prop up the shaky Tudor dynasty by linking it with the ancient, prestigious royal house of Spain. For years, Catherine was groomed for one single purpose: to become Queen of England. In 1501, at just 15, she made the long, dangerous journey to a cold, strange land to marry a prince she'd never even met. The wedding was spectacular, but the marriage was heartbreakingly brief. 5 months later, Prince Arthur was dead, leaving Catherine widowed at 16, stranded in a foreign court, alone. What happened next became one of history's most explosive questions. Did Catherine and Arthur actually consummate their marriage? Catherine swore until her dying day that they didn't. She insisted they'd only shared a bed a handful of nights, and that she came to her second marriage, a true maid, without touch of man. This one detail, seemingly small at the time, would eventually rip the Christian world in two. Henry VII didn't want to lose the Spanish alliance or send back Catherine's dowry, so he came up with an unusual plan. Catherine should marry his second son, young Prince Henry. It was legally tricky since marrying your brother's widow was forbidden by biblical law, but Catherine's claimed virginity offered a loophole. Her mother, Queen Isabella, was satisfied that her daughter remains as she was here, and the Pope granted special permission for the marriage to go forward. For 7 agonizing years, Catherine lived in limbo, a political chess piece in games played by kings. Her allowance was cut off, forcing her to sell her jewelry to pay her servants. She felt nearly naked in her worn-out gowns. Finally, in 1509, Henry VII died, and the new king, Henry VIII, a gorgeous, charismatic 18-year-old, announced he would honor the engagement. He genuinely liked Catherine. He admired her dignity and rock-solid faith. He told his council he desired her above all women. He loved her and longed to wed her. They married on June 11, 1509, and for a while they were genuinely happy. Henry called Catherine his Sir Loyal Heart, and she adored him back. Their court glittered with Renaissance culture, music, jousting tournaments, and elaborate pageants. But one dark cloud hung over everything: the succession. A queen's #1 job was producing a male heir. Tragically, Catherine couldn't seem to do it. Over several years she endured a devastating series of failed pregnancies. 1510, a stillborn daughter. 1511, a son, Prince Henry, was born to explosive celebration throughout the kingdom, but the joy lasted barely 7 weeks before the baby died. More miscarriages followed. More infant deaths. Out of at least 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. As years passed and Catherine aged, it became painfully clear there would be no more children. By 1524, she and Henry no longer shared a bed. The king, now in his 30s, became obsessed. Without a son, the Tudor line wasn't secure. The nightmare of another devastating civil war, like the Wars of the Roses that had torn England apart before his father seized the throne, loomed large. And Henry began wondering, was his lack of sons actually God's punishment? He turned to the Bible, specifically to Leviticus, and found a passage that seemed to scream his name. "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." That word, childless, hit him like lightning. Sure, he had a daughter, but to a king desperate for an heir, he might as well be childless. His conscience, he claimed, was deeply troubled. He started believing the Pope's special permission had been a mistake, that his marriage to Catherine had been sinful from day one. And right at this convenient moment of conscience crisis, he fell madly, passionately in love for the first time in his life. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She wasn't classically beautiful. She was petite, with dark hair and striking black eyes she knew exactly how to use. She had a vivacious, razor-sharp wit that captivated everyone around her. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious courtier, and Anne had spent years at the sophisticated French court, where she'd learned to dress impeccably and carry herself with such grace that people thought she was actually French. She returned to England around 1522 and became one of Queen Catherine's maids of honor. The court was instantly entranced. Among those smitten was Henry Percy, heir to a powerful earldom, and they secretly became engaged. But another, far more dangerous man had noticed Anne, the king himself. Henry, who'd had a secret affection for Anne for some time, ordered Cardinal Wolsey to break off the engagement. Anne was furious, not at the king, whose involvement she never suspected, but at Wolsey. She swore that if she ever got the chance, she'd have her revenge. Around 1526, Henry began courting her seriously. He expected Anne to become his mistress, like her own sister Mary Boleyn had been. But Anne refused. She'd watched her sister get used and discarded when the king grew bored. Anne was playing a much more dangerous, far more ambitious game. She told the king point blank, "Your wife I cannot be. Your mistress I will not be." This refusal, this declaration of virtue, only drove Henry wilder. For 7 long years he pursued her, writing passionate love letters, showering her with gifts, growing increasingly obsessed. And Anne, with calculated brilliance, kept him at arm's length, stoking the flames while never surrendering. She knew the only way to truly win was making him believe marriage was the only option. She saw her opening in the king's supposedly troubled conscience. If his marriage to Catherine was invalid, then he was free to marry again. And why not her? In 1527, Henry began seeking an annulment from the Pope, launching what became known as his Great Matter. This is where Catherine of Aragon showed her true steel. When Henry told her about his doubts, her world collapsed. But she didn't bend. She was the king's true wife. Her marriage was valid, and she'd stand by that until death. She believed Wolsey and Anne Boleyn had poisoned the king's mind, and she saw it as her sacred duty to bring him back to reason. What followed was a legal and diplomatic earthquake that shook all of Europe. Catherine appealed to her powerful nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who effectively had the Pope under his thumb after Roman troops sacked Rome. Pope Clement VII was trapped between impossible choices. He couldn't grant Henry's annulment without enraging the emperor, but refusing risked losing England from the Catholic Church entirely. So he did what weak leaders often do: he stalled. The case dragged on for years. In 1529, a special papal court convened in London to hear the case. This is where Catherine made her most dramatic stand. Instead of addressing the court, she walked across the hall, knelt at her husband's feet, and delivered a heartbreaking plea for justice in broken English. "Sir, I beseech you," she said, "for all the loves that hath been between us, take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman, and a stranger born out of your dominion." She reminded him she'd been a true, obedient wife for over 20 years, and that when he first took her, she was a true maid, without touch of man. Then she stood, curtsied, and walked out of the court, never to return. Her courage won the hearts of ordinary English people, who gathered in streets to cheer her, but it did nothing to change Henry's mind. Frustrated by papal delays and relentlessly pushed by Anne, Henry took a radical step. He started listening to reformers who argued the King of England should lead the Church in his own realm, not some Italian pope. In 1531, he separated from Catherine permanently. In January 1533, with Anne now pregnant, they secretly married. And that May, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a man sympathetic to Anne's cause, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Days later, he validated the marriage to Anne Boleyn. The break with Rome was complete. Henry was now supreme head of the Church of England. On June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony. But the crowds watched in hostile silence. They'd loved Catherine, and they saw Anne as a home-wrecking, goggle-eyed whore. Anne had won the crown, but she'd lost the people. Her triumph, though, was incomplete. On September 7, 1533, she gave birth. But it wasn't the desperately wanted son. It was a girl named Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but he told Anne, "You and I are both young, and by God's grace boys will follow." But boys didn't follow. In 1534, she miscarried. Then, in January 1536, on the exact day Catherine of Aragon was buried, Anne miscarried again, this time a male child. For Henry, this was the breaking point. "I see that God will not give me male children," he said coldly. When Anne tried blaming the miscarriage on shock from his recent jousting accident, he icily replied she should have no more boys by him. He'd turned against her completely. He began claiming he'd been seduced by witchcraft into the marriage, and that God's refusal to grant them a son proved the marriage was invalid. And once again, as his love for one wife died, his eye landed on another. Her name was Jane Seymour. She was one of Anne's own maids of honor, a quiet, pale, seemingly docile young woman, the polar opposite of the fiery, sharp-tongued Anne. Jane came from a respectable country family and had once served Catherine of Aragon, whom she deeply admired. She and her family were part of the conservative faction at court, who despised Anne and her reformist religious leanings. They saw in Jane a golden opportunity to bring Anne down. Starting in late 1535, Henry began courting Jane, lavishing her with gifts. And Jane, well coached by her ambitious brothers, played the same game Anne had once mastered. She presented herself as pure virtue personified, refusing to become the king's mistress and hinting she could only be his in marriage. For Anne, history was repeating itself with terrifying speed. She watched the king's affection shift to Jane and she panicked. But this time Henry wasn't prepared to wait another 7 years. He wanted Anne gone. A divorce or annulment would be messy and complicated. It would call their daughter Elizabeth's legitimacy into question. So Henry and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, devised a more permanent solution. In April 1536, Cromwell started building a case against the Queen. Spies gathered gossip from her household. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. She was also charged with plotting the king's death. Adultery in a queen was treason. The charges were monstrous and almost certainly fabricated, but they served their purpose perfectly. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. "Mr. Kingston," she asked the Tower's constable, "do I go into a dungeon?" "No, madam," he replied. "You shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." "It is too good for me," she sobbed, before breaking into hysterical laughter. Her trial was pure theater. The men accused with her were tried and condemned first. On May 15th, Anne and her brother stood trial in the Tower's Great Hall. She defended herself with courage and intelligence, but the verdict was predetermined. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Even now, Henry had one final twisted act of cruelty disguised as mercy. He ordered a skilled executioner from France, a man who used a sword rather than the clumsy English axe, a last perverse gesture of consideration for the woman he'd once moved heaven and earth to marry. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was calm and composed. "Good Christian people," she said, "I am come hither to die, according to law. I pray and beseech you all to pray for the life of the king, who is one of the best princes on the face of the earth, who has always treated me so well." She knelt, blindfolded. A single stroke of the sword, and it was over. As her head fell, cannons on the tower wharf fired, signaling to the king, waiting miles away, that he was free. The very next day, Henry VIII was engaged to Jane Seymour. They married 10 days later. Jane was everything Anne wasn't. Her motto was literally, "bound to obey and serve." She was gentle, quiet, and devoted to restoring a sense of calm piety to the court. She also worked to reconcile Henry with his eldest daughter, Mary, bringing her back to court and treating her with genuine kindness. But Jane knew her most critical duty. In spring 1537, the Queen was announced pregnant. The entire country held its breath. On October 12, 1537, after a long, difficult labor, she gave birth to a son. Finally, Henry had his heir, Prince Edward. The celebrations were absolutely wild. But the joy was heartbreakingly brief. Jane, weakened by childbirth, contracted puerperal fever, a common and deadly infection in those days. For days she fought for her life, but on October 24th, just 12 days after her triumph, she died. Henry was genuinely heartbroken. He'd loved Jane in his own way, and he'd later call her his only, true wife. He wore black for months and ordered the court into mourning until the following Easter. For the rest of his life, he'd cherish her memory, and he left instructions in his will to be buried beside her. The king was now a widower with 3 children, 2 daughters declared illegitimate, and an infant son. The need for another wife, another queen to mother his children, and perhaps provide more sons, was urgent. So the search began again. This time the choice was purely strategic. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, arranged a match with a German Protestant princess, Anne of Cleves, to secure an alliance against the Catholic powers of France and Spain. Henry had never laid eyes on her, but he was shown a gorgeous portrait by the great painter Hans Holbein, and he fell for the image. In January 1540, Anne of Cleves arrived in England. Henry, unable to contain his excitement, rode in disguise to Rochester to surprise her. The surprise was definitely his. The woman he met was tall, large-boned, and plain, with a face marked by smallpox scars. She looked nothing like the delicate beauty in Holbein's portrait. Henry was absolutely horrified. "I like her not! I like her not!" he raged at Cromwell. He felt completely deceived. But the political alliance was too important, and wedding preparations were too far along. With a heavy heart, he went through with the marriage on January 6, 1540. The wedding night was a complete disaster. He told Cromwell the next day, "I liked her before, not well, but now I like her much worse." He found her physically repulsive, complaining about her, evil smells, and concluding from her body that she was no virgin. "I have left her as good a maid as I found her," he declared. The marriage was never consummated. Fortunately for Anne of Cleves, she was sensible and good-humored. When, after just 6 months, Henry decided he wanted an annulment, she didn't fight him like Catherine of Aragon had. She wisely agreed to dissolve the marriage, accepted the face-saving fiction that a supposed prior engagement to another man made their union invalid, and in return, Henry was incredibly generous. He gave her a handsome income, several beautiful houses including Anne Boleyn's childhood home of Hever Castle, and the honorary title of his beloved sister. Anne lived out her days in England, in comfort and freedom, a respected member of the royal family, eventually dying of natural causes in 1557. She was, without a doubt, the luckiest of all 6 wives. The reason for Henry's sudden urgency to end the Cleves marriage was, once again, a woman. This time, it was Catherine Howard, niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and, ironically, first cousin to Anne Boleyn. She was a vivacious, pretty teenager, possibly as young as 15, when she caught the eye of the aging, obese, increasingly unwell king. Henry, now nearly 50, was completely infatuated. He called her his Rose without a thorn. They married in July 1540, just days after the Cleves annulment was finalized. Catherine was flighty, foolish, and loved nothing more than dancing, pretty clothes, and fun. Henry doted on her, showering her with jewels and indulging her every whim. But his rose had thorns he didn't know about. Before coming to court, while living in the lax household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine had affairs with 2 men, her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and a gentleman named Francis Derham. She absolutely wasn't the innocent virgin the king believed her to be. This might have stayed secret, but Catherine made a catastrophic mistake. She brought people from her past into her household as queen, including Francis Derham, whom she made her private secretary. Worse, she started an incredibly reckless flirtation with one of the king's favorite courtiers, a young man named Thomas Culpeper. With help from her lady-in-waiting, the infamous Lady Rochford, widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, she arranged secret nighttime meetings with Culpeper. In autumn 1541, while the king was traveling in the north, Archbishop Cranmer received information about the Queen's past conduct. He knew he had to tell the king, but he absolutely dreaded it. Upon Henry's return to Hampton Court, he slipped a letter detailing the accusations into Henry's hand during Mass. Henry's reaction was first disbelief, then a terrible heartbreaking sorrow. This man, who'd faced down popes and emperors, wept openly before his council, lamenting his rotten luck in meeting with such ill-conditioned wives. An investigation was launched. Derham and Culpeper were arrested, and, under interrogation and likely torture, they confessed. The evidence was damning. In February 1542, Catherine Howard, not yet 20 years old, was executed on Tower Green for treason, along with Lady Rochford. She died frightened but repentant, admitting she deserved to die but swearing she'd never been unfaithful to the king. Henry was alone again, a broken man. He was old, sick, and had been utterly humiliated. It seemed impossible he'd marry again. But a year later, in 1543, he did. His sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, a mature, twice-widowed lady in her early 30s. This wasn't a marriage of passion, but of comfort and companionship. Catherine Parr was intelligent, kind, and deeply religious. With reformist sympathies she had to carefully hide. Her greatest achievement as queen was reuniting Henry with all three of his children. She created a stable family life for Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, overseeing their education and acting as a true mother to them all. She was more nurse than wife to the ailing king, patiently tending to his foul-smelling leg ulcer and engaging him in theological debates to distract him from pain. But even this nearly destroyed her. Conservative enemies at court, led by Bishop Gardiner, tried to trap her on heresy charges, even drawing up a warrant for her arrest. But Catherine, warned just in time, cleverly threw herself on the king's mercy, claiming she only argued with him to learn from his great wisdom. Charmed, Henry forgave her and turned his fury on her accusers. Catherine Parr outlived the king. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at age 55. Catherine was at his side, and he died holding her hand, having found in his final years some measure of peace with this good, gentle woman. After his death, she finally married the man she'd loved all along, Thomas Seymour, but her happiness was brief. She died in childbirth in 1548, the last of Henry's 6 remarkable wives. So there you have it. The sweeping, dramatic, often tragic story of 6 women bound by fate to one of history's most formidable men. When you step back from the individual stories, a larger picture emerges, one that tells us a lot about their world, and maybe something about ours too. At its core, this is a story about power. The absolute, unquestionable power of a king, and the almost complete powerlessness of the women around him, even those wearing crowns. Each of these women, in her own way, had to navigate a world where survival depended on pleasing one man and giving him a son. It was an impossible task, and for many, it ended in heartbreak and death. Catherine of Aragon's story is a profound lesson in principle and endurance. She refused to compromise her identity as queen and wife, even when it cost her everything. In her unwavering belief in the rightness of her cause, she became a symbol of defiance, a woman who'd rather break than bend. Anne Boleyn, on the other hand, is a masterclass in ambition. She saw an opportunity and seized it with both hands, refusing to play by the rules and instead rewriting them entirely. She was revolutionary, and while her ambition ultimately destroyed her, it's impossible not to feel awe at her audacity. She gambled for the highest prize, and, for a time, she actually won. Jane Seymour's story is quieter but no less significant. She represents the ideal Tudor woman, meek, obedient, fruitful. She succeeded where others had failed. but her story is also a heartbreaking reminder of childbirth's dangers in that era. Her death highlights life's fragility, even for a queen at her moment of triumph. And then there are the later wives, each offering a lesson in survival. Anne of Cleves, the political pawn, showed incredible shrewdness in turning humiliating rejection into comfortable independence. Catherine Howard's story is a tragic cautionary tale about youth, foolishness, and the brutal consequences of getting caught in courtly intrigue. And finally, Catherine Parr, the survivor, who brought peace and stability to the king's chaotic final years, showing that wisdom and kindness could be their own form of power. So what can we, living centuries later, take from these stories? I think it's a deeper appreciation for the constraints that shaped women's lives throughout history, and admiration for the different ways these women responded. Some fought, some submitted, some adapted, some survived. There's no single right way to navigate a world not built for you. Each of their lives testifies to a different kind of strength. This story reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts. It's made up of the choices, hopes, and heartbreaks of real people. These 6 women weren't just queens. They were daughters, sisters, lovers, and mothers, each struggling to find her place in a dangerous, unforgiving world. And in their stories, we see the enduring power of the human spirit to love, to strive, and to endure. That was a summary of The 6 Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. We've journeyed through dramatic highs and tragic lows today, but here's the truth. A summary can only ever be a map of the territory. The real treasure is found when you walk the path yourself. The true magic of this book lives in the rich detail, the subtle moments of human connection, and the immersive world that Alison Weir so brilliantly creates. This summary is just an invitation, a glimpse through the keyhole. If any of these incredible stories resonated with you, if you felt a spark of curiosity or a pang of sympathy, then I genuinely encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about experiencing it, and in doing so, you might just find it changes the way you think about the past and the people who lived it. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey back to the Tudor court was valuable to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.